Hello, Justin. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Sonia. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. All right. Well, I'm super excited about this discussion. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Tell me about your company, Insight.
Sure. I started Insight, let's see, I guess about 6 or 7 years ago when I moved to Germany. Long story short, I was not seeking entrepreneurship. It kind of found me out of desperation because I had moved here. We moved here when we had children to be closer to my wife's family. And due to change of events, I didn't have a job and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I started off helping foreign executives, mostly ones living here in Germany, with their communication skills. They many of your listeners might know this. Germans generally have a very high level. They speak a very high level of English. But where things get lost sometimes is in the subtle communication
Okay.
cues. They speak a very direct form of English,
Okay.
which can be good. You know, I'm from New York, so I know how that goes, and I'm a big believer in being honest and direct. But sometimes, depending on the audience, it can be misinterpreted as arrogant
Okay.
or just a lot of misunderstandings. So that's how Insight started. I was helping these executives with their communication style, and everything from emails to presentations, any dealings they were having with English-speaking companies and American companies, that kind of thing. But it's grown since then because as I started writing about my experiences, and I got a column on Inc. Magazine for Inc.com, so the digital version of Inc. magazine, and the focus of my work really became emotional intelligence. Because what happened is I found that I was giving a lot of advice to these executives and to these teams on not just the communication in the English language, but the how they were handling their emotions. Because they would get frustrated that they were getting a lot of their communication was getting misinterpreted. And then they would start telling me about the problems they were having internally and in their teams, their own teams, their German teams. And so I had gotten a lot of training on this. I spent 13 years with a major nonprofit in New York, and that's really where my education came from, my practical everyday management education. And they taught us a lot about putting people first and treating people with empathy. And so this became my primary work, writing about it, sharing it with others. And so nowadays, that's what I advise companies on, is how they can reach customers, but also internally, people on an emotional level, how they can motivate them, how they can better engage their employees, how they can solve conflict management problems. And a lot of this is through individuals too. They'll write in because of my column, and I love engaging engaging with readers. So I give a lot of free advice, believe it or not, but it you know what it comes around because they spread the word, and then clients will come in asking for help with whatever problems they have.
That is fantastic. It's fantastic that people are more and more starting to recognize that developing in these softer skills is just as important as some of the hard core skills and the products and services that you offer, because it's all about how you make other people feel, right? So if you're able to connect with them in a way, and that's not always the easiest thing to do, it really does pay dividends. So I'm super glad that you're doing that, and people are seeking it out as well. Now you mentioned like this is the focus of your work. Now you just published a book. It's hot off the presses. EQ Applied, which is all about emotional intelligence. Now, what is emotional intelligence? Just so we're all on the same page, and why is it such an important trait for businesses?
Sure. So many listeners may have heard emotional intelligence in the last couple of decades. Actually, it was about 20 years ago when it first became very popular through Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. And basically, excuse me, getting over a cold here.
No problem.
Basically, emotional intelligence is just how do you manage your own emotions and how do you manage others' emotions. So it comes down to how do you deal with conflict? How do you deal um, with internal conflict? So when you're extremely emotional, all of us have made decisions when we're in a very emotional state that we wish we could take things back, or we wish we could have handled things differently. And that's basically what emotional intelligence is. The way I define it, I make it very simple, very practical, one sentence. Emotional intelligence is making your emotions work for you instead of making them work against you.
Okay.
So we can get into a lot more details of that, but that's basically what it is.
Okay. And how does emotional intelligence, whenever people are making it work for them, how can they make it work for them to deliver remarkable experiences for their customers?
Yeah, well, I think you quoted what's actually a famous quote a couple minutes ago, which is people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget the way you make them feel.
Right.
And that's so true, because people do business with businesses because of that emotional experience they have. And there's many ways that manifests itself. It may be that they do business with someone because it's very, very convenient, or with a company because it's very convenient. It's very quick. It could be because they have great customer service. It could be because they like the way they're treated when they go into whatever the business is, or whenever they have their experience with the company. So that's really what it comes down to, and it's in many different ways. But what kind of experience are you giving your customer? If they feel good emotionally with what you're offering them, then they're going to keep coming back. As opposed to, something can be a good deal, and that's great, and that may keep some customers coming back, but only if they still connect emotionally with that company. If that's very important to them, the fact that they're getting something, a good deal, they're getting something very inexpensive, the minute they have a bad experience with that company, it's easily going to turn them away.
Sure.
And we can see that right now with the airline industry. Actually, it's interesting because the data is showing that people continue to come back for the cheapest airline tickets, but the companies are still so concerned with the bad PR that they're getting, because they know potentially how quickly it can change, and how quickly people can go. And this is why companies like Southwest, like JetBlue, are doing so well, because not only are they offering a less expensive plane ticket, but they're also working on the customer experience.
Right.
And you see that becoming more and more important to the larger airlines, where in the past they just didn't care, because they said, well, look, they're still buying from us, they're still flying with us, but now they're seeing that these smaller airlines that are concentrating on both the success that they're having, and it's influencing how they move forward as well. For
sure. I imagine there are plenty of stories, and you kind of just gave that anecdote there with the airline industry, but what would you say is one of, like, you've done a lot of research on this over the years, do you have a favorite story of when emotional intelligence really worked in favor of a business and how they were dealing with their customers?
Well, I have a bunch. I think Starbucks is one I tend to write about a lot and talk about a lot, and for both good and bad. Starbucks, for many people, they'll know, well, they've been in the news for some bad reasons lately, but might reference that again in the future. But years ago, they were really doing bad because they lost touch with their target customer and the businesses. When Howard Schultz first stepped away from the company. And they really started going downhill over the next several years. And when he came back, he realized, look, we've gotten away from what we're trying to do, which is create an experience for our customers. And when he came back, he was able to conduct this turnaround. And, he started connecting and, again, offering a valuable experience. People don't pay $4 or $5 for a cup of coffee because it's a great cup of coffee. Regardless of how you feel about Starbucks. It's because Starbucks began offering experience that many people valued. And so he was able to turn them around. Apple's another example of, Steve Jobs coming in and saying, look, we're trying to do way too much stuff. Let's narrow it down to a few things. Let's do them very well. And let's connect with our customers emotionally. And then we all know what happened with that. And then the last one, you asked for one, I'm going to give you three. The last one that's one of my favorites lately is Tesla. Okay. Now, Tesla, I personally think Elon Musk is a genius. He's not perfect. He makes mistakes, and he's made mistakes recently, but he's a genius in that he has been able to build this entire company based on an emotional connection with his customers. And he does that through social media. This guy has, I don't know how many millions of followers because it's growing every day. And yet he'll sit down and he'll go on it's not really a tweet storm. It's just, he's sharing his thoughts randomly on Twitter, and he'll respond to the first few or 10 or whoever that respond to him. And, so many people love Elon Musk, and he's built that company up. We're talking about a company that has not made, a profit traditionally, that's barely selling anything. And they last year became the most valuable car company in America.
Oh my goodness.
Now that's changed slightly since then, but that's built solely on him connecting emotionally with customers and also with his employees, and I write a lot about his employee emails, and how great his communication style is. Now, I don't work in Tesla. I've never worked directly with them. So this is all that we see from the outside, because I know that, they're like any company, Tesla has issues, and some have come to me with those too. But generally speaking, I think Tesla's a perfect example of how to build your company based on emotion. And that's where it becomes important, and that's what I write about a lot in the book. It can't be purely on emotion, okay?
Right.
Because like anything, you have to balance emotion with other things, and emotional intelligence is the exact same thing. It's a great thing to have, and it's very helpful, but it has to be balanced with other qualities as well.
For sure. Now, I really enjoyed going through your book, and I could see practical applications for both my business life and my personal life, which is always a great thing. I feel like they're always so connected. And one of the things that sort of intrigued me were your 4 abilities of emotional intelligence. Can you walk us through those?
Sure, yeah. So I didn't invent these by any means. The first one that I saw that described them in very similar terms was Daniel Goleman.
Okay.
And he did that in connection with at least one other co-author in his book Primal Leadership. He's written a lot about it since then, and others have different takes. But basically it comes down to those 4, he calls them 4 domains, I call them 4 abilities.
Okay.
So we start with self-awareness. So your awareness of self, of your own emotions, how your emotions affect your thinking, how your emotions affect your decision making, and that's both in the moment and also long term. So how does it affect the mood that I'm in right now? How does it affect how we'll feel about something over the long term, the short term? The next step after self-awareness is self-management. So based on this knowledge that I have of myself, am I able to manage my emotions? Now, some people come to me come to me and they say, do you really want to manage your emotions? Well, here's an example of why you do want to at times.
Okay.
So let's say that I'm extremely upset about something. I read something, or I'm having a conversation with my partner, and it just takes a turn for the worse. And now, if I continue to just let my emotions run wild, I'm probably going to say or do something that I later regret. Okay? Whereas one practice, which we call the pause, which the pause is basically just taking a few moments to slow down, to see the big picture, to say, wait, and it seems like such a basic practice, and it is, but I say it's easy in theory and difficult in practice, okay? Because we've all been there where it's like we know we should stop the conversation or take a break, and we don't. We keep going and we yell or we say something that we wish we could take back later. So this is self-management. If I'm able to take a pause and say, just shut my mouth and be quiet, because I know if I keep going, I'm going to say something that I regret. Whereas if I just let my partner speak, or if I say, you know what, I need 10 minutes, and I go take a walk, or I take 10 seconds, and I calm myself down and I count to 10 and I take a few deep breaths, then oftentimes I can bring myself to a place where the conversation becomes more manageable, and it can be more rational. And sometimes it takes, stopping the conversation right then and coming back to it 20 minutes later or an hour later or a couple days later. But those type of techniques are where you can manage your emotions and you'll be happy for it. You'll handle the situation in a much better way. It's the same thing with email, right? We've all written an angry email.
Yes. And
you come back an hour later and you're like, why did I write? Why did I send this out?
Yes.
As opposed to, if you have to write the email, but don't send it, right? So take a break, go for a walk, come back to it, and then usually even 20 minutes later, you're like, oh no, I don't want to send this, and you rephrase it, and, you can write it in a much more emotionally intelligent manner. So that's self-management. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 is social awareness. So your awareness of how other people's emotions affect them and their decision making. So going back to that conversation, say I'm having a conversation with my wife and she starts to get heated. Okay, so I start to realize, okay, I may be very emotionally balanced in this conversation, but I notice through her tone or a remark she makes, hey, wait a second, she's starting to take this personally, she's starting to get sensitive about this, and that now will affect how I continue to go on the conversation. We can have that with our workmates, our colleagues, we can have it with our friends. So being able to recognize other people's emotions and how it's affecting them, and it really has to tie in with empathy.
Yes.
Which is a quality I think we might talk about more later, but it's a quality that a lot of people want and think that they have, but it's a lot harder than people think.
Right.
But anyway, so empathy is really tied into social awareness. And one other thing I'll say about social awareness, a lot of critics of emotional intelligence, of empathy, will say, you can't really read another person's feelings. And that's kind of true to an extent. And knowing that can really help because, a person may be smiling and you think you know why they're smiling, or they may be in a certain mood and you think, number one, you know what their mood is and you're wrong, or number two, you think you know why they're in the mood they're in and you're wrong. So acknowledging that too, that these are all educated guesses, okay? And so, it's like anything. Just because we can't read other people's minds or emotions doesn't mean that we don't try, because trying to show empathy to someone is going to get you in a lot better place than you would be otherwise.
Right.
So it's just making those educated guesses and trying to understand people, realizing, hey, you might be getting this wrong. And so adjusting to that. If you realize, okay, oh no, I don't think I've got this, I don't think I'm reading this person right, then you can adjust to that as well. And now we're getting into relationship management. That's the fourth ability, is using all this knowledge about yourself, your own self-management, your ability to manage your own emotions, your awareness of other people's emotions and thinking, and using that to manage your relationships. So it doesn't mean trying to manipulate people, which that is an element of emotional intelligence. I call that the dark side of emotional intelligence. See people that try to manipulate others with the knowledge they have about their emotions. I'm highly against that, and that's one reason I teach people about this quality, so they can protect themselves from that. But what I try to advocate is using it in a way to manage situations so that you can help people make decisions they're proud of. Right. So in other words, you realize, again, going back to that same example, you realize that they're starting to make an irrational decision, a decision they may regret later because they're in a very emotional state. So recognizing that and being able to handle that type of conflict, or just long-term, how to build trust in your relationship over time. Things like that. That's all relationship management.
Very good. There's so much there, and it's all needed, all necessary. So what would you tell a leader, and I'm sure you do this all the time, who wants to grow in emotional intelligence, whether they feel like, oh, this is not my strong suit at all, I really need to get better, or they're even decent at it and they just want to get even better at it so that they can connect at a deeper level with others. What would you say is the place that they should start in terms of working this skill?
Well, as you know, I talk a lot about those techniques in the book, but I could really narrow it down, at least as a start, to two things. One is perspective taking. Okay. So getting the perspective of others and understanding how others view you. Okay. Now, that's, again, to be done with balance, okay, because you don't want to try to become a different person to please other people. But it's more about it's like, illustration I use is the sound of your own voice. When we hear our voice, when I hear this podcast, I'll be like, oh man, that's how I really sound. Because the way we sound to ourselves is completely different from the way others hear us. Right. And so it's the same thing with the way we're perceived the way we perceive ourselves is so much different from the way others perceive us. So getting that perspective, asking people that we trust, whether it's colleagues that we trust, friends that we trust, the people that are close to us in our lives, asking them for a perspective. And I have a list of questions in the book like, how would you describe the way I make my decisions? How would you describe my genuine mood? Or how would you describe the way my mood affects the way I make decisions? This is just a small sample of the type of questions that getting perspective from others can help round out the way you see yourself. Because in reality, you're going to have a set of data that you see, that you know internally that they won't have, but they're going to have data to give back to you, and that feedback can help you to have a more well-rounded view of the real, the real person, who you really are. So that's step one, is getting that perspective taking. And then two, taking time to reflect. And that's something that's become harder and harder to do nowadays because why? We're tied to our phones, we're constantly communicating, we're constantly eating, we're constantly checking, we're constantly learning, which is good, but we don't take as much time to sit back and think, I think, as we had in the past. So scheduling time to just block out time in your schedule to just sit down and think. And you can think when you're on your commute. You can think when you're walking or when you're taking the train or when you're driving or these other times, and that's great. But you can't underestimate the time of sitting at your desk with nothing in front of you and taking 20 minutes to half an hour to longer to just sit back and reflect. And a lot of people talk about meditation nowadays, and there's different forms of meditation, and the type of meditation I really preach is deep, concentrated thinking, not emptying your mind, but thinking focused on your own emotions, on your own actions. Why do I do the things I do in an instance where I acted in a way that I regret? Why did I act that way? What things led up to that? And this is a lot of things we get into in the book is how your experiences and how your habits affect your reactions and how you can actually change those if you're reacting in a way that you don't like or in a way that you wish you could change, how to do that. But it begins with that making time for self-reflection.
Got it. And it's a great starting point, and something that definitely takes a lot of commitment to be able to make sure that you're going to be able to improve. What about for those leaders who they're performing well on, they've got a high level of emotional intelligence, but they know it's not just about them because they're not the only ones who are working to serve their customers. It's about the team. It's about the organization, the culture that exists. What advice do you have for how they can get others, or they can cultivate a culture within their team or within their organization that has emotional intelligence as a competency?
Sure. So as with anything, the best way to encourage others to do something is to set the right example, right? So one example I use recently that I think has mainly been a good example, and I wrote his pronunciation of his last name down because I'm still learning it. So Dara Khosrowshahi, he's the relatively new CEO of Uber. And he's made a lot of very concentrated efforts to turn Uber around, to turn around their culture, which is not an easy thing to do, because the culture is really baked into a company. So I think it's going to take years if he's successful at being able to do this. And again, he's not a perfect example, as none of us are. A lot of people will ask me, who's a good example of emotional intelligence? It's hard to say because emotional intelligence is tied in a lot to motive too, and it's difficult to tell why people are making the decisions they are. So I try to instead of identify people that are emotionally intelligent, I try to identify actions that are emotionally intelligent. And so one example is an email he wrote some months ago, soon after he took over the reins at Uber. And it was after what happened in London, where they actually banned the Uber app. And there's been a lot of conflict there. But anyway, he wrote an email to employees saying, basically, look, we should not be surprised that this happened because there are consequences to decisions we've made and actions we've taken as a company. And this is basically the consequences that we're suffering. And instead of like painting out the city of London to be the enemy,
Right,
or
right.
like, oh, they're anti-innovation, or like, instead of responding that way, he said, what can we learn from this example about, the actions we've taken in the past, about the consequences we're facing now, about how we can change things in the future. And I thought that's a perfect example of a company leader showing how to learn from experience, how to self-reflect. So I would advocate that company leaders do that. When they mess up, when a company messes up, take responsibility and spell it out for your employees.
Right.
Look, this is what we did wrong. This is what I've learned from it. Let's take some time to reflect on how we can do better. On the smaller scale, you can actually do that together. As you're meeting with company executives or your team members, whatever, you can actually do that in a meeting together. And Amazon does a great thing. It's been getting a lot of press lately. They'll actually start their meetings with silence. This is a trick I've adopted in a lot of my meetings. You take the first 20 to 30 minutes of a meeting, which seems like a waste of time. Like, you start it with silence, with a long, well thought out memo, and everyone in the meeting reads that memo. Okay, and it gives them a chance to really pour over it. And that's how you could do it together in a meeting, is you give them a memo where you talk about lessons learned, that kind of thing. But, to make sure, because, people come into meetings unprepared. So give them 20 minutes or 15 or whatever, adjust it to your own company culture. But give them some time to pour over it, to think about it, and then discuss it together. Okay, and that's one way that you can really inspire self-reflection, and learning from those type of experiences. But that's how you can set the example and inspire your people to do the same.
Cool. There's lots of rich information here. I love it. Now, as more and more businesses are starting to have customers who are diverse, whether they're in the U.S. and they see the changing makeup of all the different populations of people, there's about to soon be a minority majority, or whether it's you're a global business and you've got customers from all over the world. What is the intersection, or is there one, between cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence? How do they work together, if at all?
Deffinitely. So I'm a big believer in cultural intelligence. One of the reasons is I grew up in a part of the United States, and due to my family background too, that was very multicultural. Mm-hmm. My father's from the Philippines. Okay. My mother is American, but with Portuguese and Irish roots. The part of the U.S. I grew up in, Norfolk, Virginia, it's predominantly African American. So most of my friends growing up in school were Black Americans. And so we would watch a news report. I can still remember, for example, when O.J. Simpson went on the run. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I remember it clear as day. We're watching this on the news. We're all riveted on the television. And then afterwards, I talked to my parents about it. I talked to my friends about it. And everybody has different emotional reactions to that experience, Why? It's based on their personal experience. Mm-hmm. It's based on their culture. It's based on their background and what they've experienced. And so that goes to show that how important cultural intelligence is, because we're limited by the experiences we've had, by the background we've had. So getting to know, that's why diversity in companies is so important. And I'm glad to see companies, reaching out to get more diversity on their boards, to get more diversity in their employees, because then they are able to relate to more perspectives and more different types of customers. But at the end, so even though there are different emotional reactions, the emotions themselves are the same.
Right.
Okay? We all get angry, we all get happy, we all get sad, okay? And the reasons why are different across cultures, but the more you learn about different cultures, in the beginning it's all differences. And it's like, oh man, this is different and this is how. But what I like to concentrate is, how are we alike? Okay, knowing the differences is important, and that can help you navigate those relationships. But for your relationships, focus on how are you alike, because we have much more in common than we have different. Mm-hmm. Okay, and focusing on that, and that's one way. For example, with empathy, if you're talking to someone and they talk about something that makes them angry, and you think, well, that's not a big deal, many. We'll go to race just because it's so easy to talk about. Many white Americans find it difficult to identify with a Black American's experience. Say, because what? Because they've never experienced that before. They've never been over for no reason. They've never been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. So instead of trying to relate to the experience that they've never had, try to relate to the feeling. Because we've all been treated unfairly somehow, some way, whether it's because of your sex, if you're a woman, or if it's because of something else in your background, or you're just in a situation where, you know, where you're different from the others in that situation. You can relate to the feeling of being treated unfairly. So that's the key in working across cultures, and really in empathy in general. Try to relate to the feeling another person has, not their experience, because even if we had the same experience, we're going to feel somewhat differently about it than they did. We're going to handle things differently than they did. But if someone's angry, okay, try to understand why are they angry, or try to understand when have I been angry, why was I angry, and relate to that feeling. Okay, so you feel angry. Yeah, I know what it's like to feel angry, and that can help you to understand them better and to hear them out, because you want to be heard out when you're angry. And the fact that you give them that time and attention and effort will inspire them to listen to what you have to say, and that builds trust in the relationship.
Yeah, and I love that, because it's the building the trust is, there's so many layers to it. There's empathy, there's time, there's you know, basically acknowledging someone else's feelings, and at the same time being able to communicate your own. So I think as trust is an integral component of being able to earn the loyalty of your customers. So if businesses think about, I have to earn the trust of my customers, and that will reap the dividends, that will get them thinking about how they interact with them in a different way.
Definitely.
Yeah. Justin, this has been fantastic. Where can people find you if they want to read more of your work, they want to get your book? How can they access? How can they, get more from you?
Yeah. So when this podcast airs, I believe the book will be officially launched.
Yep.
So you can find it on all major platforms. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere where you typically buy books, it should be available there. You can also check out my website directly, so eqapplied.com, eqapplied.com, and it should have links to the book. Also, if you don't want to buy the book, you just want to read my take on emotional intelligence and see how it manifests itself in the real world, that website will also take you to a list of my most popular articles and just real life examples, both in business, but also from my personal life and from others' lives, where you can see, oh, okay, this is what emotional intelligence looks like in everyday life.
Got it. And they should definitely buy the book, because it's great and it's super helpful. But I'll have all that information in the show notes so people can find it. Any parting words of wisdom for business leaders who want to apply emotional intelligence as a means to consistently deliver remarkable experiences for their customers?
Sure. I would just say don't get complacent, because emotional intelligence it's a skill. It's like any skill, really. You have to continually practice it and renew it. If you're for those of you that are that play a musical instrument, as well as good as you play that instrument, if you stop practicing, then you're going to get rusty, and eventually you would lose the ability altogether to play. So emotional intelligence is the same way. You just when you think you've got it, and you're making good decisions, balanced, rational decisions, is the moment where you get caught off guard in a situation, and and really that's going to happen anyway. We're all going to be victim of our emotions at some point, but continuing that self-reflection regularly, continuing that perspective taking, can help us to do as good as possible, and can help us to remain in practice, so that those situations will be fewer and further between. And most of the time, you'll find that even when a situation you're confronted with a situation that you become very emotional, that you can use that as a power for good, that you can use it as a catalyst to, because there's nothing wrong with getting emotional. It's just a matter of learning to harness those emotions and to harness those emotions and make them, again, make them work for you instead of against you.
For sure. Again, thank you, Justin. This has been super cool.
Thank you very much, Sonia.